Welcome to Spicer & Company. I'm Sean Spicer.
And I'm Lindsay Keith. Protests here in D.C. continue today, and the streets around the White House remained closed to traffic.
Yeah, over the past 24 hours, a mob actively tried to take down a monument to Andrew Jackson that was in Lafayette Square. This is a guy who fought in the Battle of New Orleans, became president, and died more than a decade before the Civil War even happened. President Trump, though, is calling for a tough response for these attacks on the monument. Let's take a listen.
We are looking at long-term jail sentences for these vandals and these hoodlums and these anarchists and agitators, and call them whatever you want. Some people don't like that language, but that's what they are.
Well, the Interior Secretary, David Bernhardt, and that's the department that oversees these federal lands and monuments, he tweeted about the protest in Lafayette Square saying, quote, "Another so-called peaceful protest led to destruction. We will not bow to anarchists. Law and order will prevail and justice will be served." Now, the good news is the statue is still standing in Lafayette Park. And while we can all agree, I think, that justice needs to be done, especially for what happened to George Floyd, and it needs to be served. But there's a right to assemble and a right to protest that we all agree is under the First Amendment, especially when it comes to issues concerning racism and police reform. But we're still unclear about one of the most important questions. How does this all play out? Check the scene from last night in Lafayette Square. I can't describe it enough.
They don't care that we just have cardboard! They saw you! What the wrong with you?
So what am I going to say?
This is the country of the
I hear that. What's your name? I like you.
How do you sleep at night? She says to the cop. I hope to God, and I mean this in all seriousness, that she never has to call 911 or never has a problem. Because as much as we have concerns and they need to be addressed, and that's why people are out there, to yell at these guys like this for standing there doing their job, and you notice they take it all, they just take it in. These are people who have dedicated their lives, they're not looking for money, but for serving this country, this community, keeping us safe, making sure that they put themselves in harm's way when something's going wrong, and they don't deserve that. I truly hope that she never has to need the police to realize how wrong she is. Well, joining us now to talk about the White House's approach to moving forward and police reform and all that is the president's point man on this in the White House, Deputy Assistant to the President, Jaron Smith. Jaron, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sean. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for being here. I know you've been a busy man the last couple days, if not the last few weeks. Jaron, let me just ask you before we get onto the movement. You're right there in the front of the White House, pretty much across the street from Lafayette Park where the statue was. You know, we're starting to see statues being toppled almost because they're statues, right? I still don't understand what Andrew Jackson's role has to do in police reform or racial justice with respect to how it all came from George Floyd. Just this week, we're seeing a monument to Holocaust survivors in Santa Rosa, California, getting torn down. I guess the question I want to start with is, have we gone too far?
Well, I think the left is focused on tearing down statues. The president's focused on fixing disparities. In Dallas, he offered 4 different solutions to deal with historic disparities, issues ranging for creating school choice for African-American children and allowing them them to choose the school of their choosing, all the way to access to capital and creating the Minority Business Development Agency and making it permanent, to other things like health disparities and investing in minority-serving institutions, or even police reform. We just signed an executive order just last week that would allow for more accountability, more standards, and more incentives to encourage more community policing throughout the country. I think with those 4 elements, we can deal with those disparities and help communities of color grow.
You know, what I love about the approach that you're taking is it's getting to the root cause of this stuff, right? That this disparity in terms of wealth and education, we've got to address that instead of trying to figure out how to fix it at the other end, right? If you can fix it at the beginning, it doesn't become as exacerbated as it's going in. And that's where I think the interesting thing about this approach is, because the question is, by the time you get to the police issue, you've already gone too far, right? If you can stem it early on and figure out how do we stop that disparity between classes and economics, it solves a lot of those problems. But specifically in terms of police reform, have you guys looked at different police departments as models or different training as models of what other police departments can model off of?
Yes, there's a number of different police departments that have very high standards. We were actually looking at the CALEA standard, which is a organization of the National Sheriffs, Fraternal Order of Police, as well as International Association of Chiefs of Police. Those three organizations were integral in helping us work through the executive order. But it wasn't just police. We worked with the families and groups that represented the families, like the Reform Alliance. And so we wish that Congress would follow the president's lead, which brings both sides together to create a solution to the problem. And we're looking at the Senate right now. I think that the direction that Senator Scott's going in is something we can certainly be supportive of, because it's common sense reform. It's about building trust between the two communities, and that's what the president's committed to.
You know, I had Ben Carson on the show last week, and I was talking to him about what he tells the president, or what experiences does he share with the president. You are the highest ranking black official in the Trump White House. Do you talk to the president about your experience with race and racism, or with the police? I mean, how much do you share your personal experience with the president to help guide this policy?
Sure. So my personal experience extends back from day one with the president on all the things that we've done since the beginning of the administration to help with disparities. And so before we had the protests and before COVID, the president has set up infrastructures to deal with those issues, because he made a commitment on the campaign trail to focus on the forgotten Americans. And since I come from one of those communities, and I actually live in one of those communities now, I'm able to give voice to the actual people. People right now want opportunity, and they want opportunity now. And so everything that we've been focused on is creating infrastructure on the federal level to work with local partners to create that opportunity.
You know, Jerron, one of the things that's interesting, I talked to the president about this when I interviewed him. I talked about this with Ben Carson. But the president seems to have the policy piece down, and you've been echoing that over and over again, right? What he's doing to increase opportunities, to level the playing field, et cetera. You've talked about it in the past. I've heard you talk about HBCUs, opportunity zones. But do you think that the imagery needs to change? In other words, should he go out and walk the streets of a black community? Should he go to a black church? Should he be going into these communities more and showing that he, you know, visually and image-wise cares about it? Because I think part of it is you got the policy piece down, but do we have the imagery down, which is what I think Biden's kind of got the opposite problem, right? He doesn't have the policy, but he's going out and doing and saying all the right things.
Well, I think that the media doesn't give him fair coverage of when he does do the outreach. The first time that HBCU presidents ever came to Washington, D.C. and the Oval Office was at our White House. The first time that you had the National Bankers Association in the Oval Office was during our White House. And so we've spent some time in some churches. We just was with some black ministers in Dallas, but the mainstream media doesn't always cover that activity. And so the president is doing that work, and he's doing that work because it's the right thing, not because of the politics. I think my experience with him has showed me that he just really cares about these communities, and he wants to see outcomes and do the work rather than have the photo op. I think the left has unfairly labeled us as wanting to have photo ops, but we're actually showing up and doing the work and building relationships in a lot of unique ways.
Well, that's why it's important. I appreciate you coming on the show, and I know you've been doing a lot of these interviews because I think it's right. I mean, you going out there and explaining all of this gets people to understand what he's been doing, what this White House has done, and I think that's crucial because you're right. There's a lot of these policies and a lot of these actions that just don't get the coverage. So, you know, thank you for coming on and walking us through all that.
Exactly right.
I hope to have you back soon to continue this conversation.
Thanks so much, Sean. Always good to see you.
Good to see you soon.